All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's program, Armchair Travel to Greece, specifically Corfu, with the Traveling Librarian. So we're joined by Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for his newest armchair travel presentation. His series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, we're traveling to Corfu, a jewel in the Ionian. Oh, Jeff, I should have practiced this. I screwed it.
Ionian.
Ionian, thank you. And a jewel in the Ionian Sea, which offers a blend of history, natural beauty, and vibrant culture. We're going to explore the charming streets of Corfu Town, a World Heritage Site, and marvel at its Venetian architecture. Relax on pristine beaches or discover hidden covers along the coast. Embark on a boat trip to nearby islands or hike through the lush olive groves. Well, it's warm hospitality, delicious cuisine, and fascinating history. Corfu promises to be an unforgettable Greek getaway. And so Jeff Klapes is the recently retired head of reference services at the Beebe Memorial Library in nearby Wakefield. And he, of course, is an avid traveler and photographer. So again, I want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring. So all 120 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We're used to seeing Jeff on Tuesdays, Friday afternoon. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. It's Friday the 13th also. So I hope this is a way of enjoying some good luck on Friday the 13th. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started right away. As Robert said, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat there we go, or into the Q&A, and I will try to keep an eye on those as we go through and stick around at the end if there's anything that I missed. So let's get started right away. This is a trip that I actually did very recently in the fall. When was it? October, which is a very nice time to be in the Mediterranean. And I will start, as I always do, with kind of putting the place on the map. Corfu is one of the most visited of the Mediterranean islands, partly because of cruise ships, but not only because of that. And in some ways, you could say it's kind of the least Greek of all the Greek islands. And part of that is because of its location, which is right here, if you can see. It's right at the northern border of Greece. It's the northernmost major Greek island off the coast of Albania and very close to the heel of Italy. I want to talk just a couple of seconds about the way that the Greek islands are described in different groups. Greece has about 6,000 islands total, although only about 200 of them are inhabited by actual people living there. And I want to quickly go over the groups just so you understand why they have different personalities and why Corfu is going to be different from some others that you may be familiar with. The color coding on this map conveniently shows how the different Greek islands are organized. The ones that you most are familiar with, because they're on the cover of every Greek guidebook, are the orange ones here called the Kyklades. And Kyklades refers to the fact that they are in a circle. And historically, the Kyklades are, the idea was that they form a circular design shape around the sacred island of Delos, which was in the middle. And the other major group that is often visited, the yellow ones over in the corner, are called the Dodecanese in English. And Dodeka is the Greek word for 12, and that's because there were 12 major islands in that area. Rhodes is by far the best known. There's also the northern Aegean Islands. There's the small group here called the Sporades. There's the Saronic Islands, which are the ones closest to the capital of Athens, which is right about here in the Saronic Gulf. And Corfu, which we're going to visit today, is part of this green group here along the western coast of Greece in the Ionian Sea. They're the Ionian Islands. And Corfu is, of all the islands in the Aegean that belong to Greece, Corfu is actually the seventh largest in area, and it's about 40 miles long. For those of you who are nearby in Massachusetts, this is a rough idea of the size. Here's Corfu superimposed over the Boston metro area, just to give you a rough idea of how big it is. It is very close to both the Greek coast, which is here. This is actually the border between Greece and Albania. So it's extremely close to the Albanian coast, only a couple of kilometers, and also to the Greek coast here. If you're traveling by ferry, you can fly there very easily. It's not even an hour from Athens. If you want to drive, you're most likely to take a ferry from Igoumenitsa, which is a city here on the mainland, and would take you in barely an hour or so over to the main port, the capital of the island. In Greek, I need to talk a little bit about the name, because in Greek, the island is known as Kerkyra, and that comes from the name of a nymph who was brought there by the god Poseidon. You're probably aware that in much of Greek mythology, there were various gods, Zeus and Poseidon among them, who were well known for their romantic exploits. And they often were traipsing off with nymphs to one island or another. And in this case, the name comes from the nymph that Poseidon brought there. So in the course of this program, I'm going to, because of the audience being mostly here in the United States, I'm going to refer to the island as Corfu. But it's important to remember that to the Greeks, this is Kerkyra, and you will hear it in Greece described as Kerkyra. That's its name. But Corfu, the name Corfu, also comes from Greek because, and I'll show you this in just a minute, the main capital has an important fortress that guarded it for many centuries, and it has two hills which are called Corifii, meaning sort of hilltops, summits. So that is a name that originally comes from Greek, but was corrupted a little bit over the years through Italian and English and other languages. And so most people outside of Greece refer to the island of Corfu. So I'll use that name today for purposes of this program, just to make things easier. And as you can see from this map, the red is where we explored. We had a rental car and we're there for about a week. So we saw most of the island. It's quite mountainous. The highest point is about 3,000 feet, which is right up here. And the only part we really didn't get to was the very southern tip, which doesn't honestly actually have that much to see. There's a couple of villages there. But the most dramatic scenery is all along the western coast, particularly the northwest, where there are enormous cliffs that plunge down to the sea, lots of hidden beaches and coves. It's an absolutely gorgeous island for scenery. It's also very different from a lot of the islands that you may be familiar with from typical Greek imagery, because the Ionian Islands are much more lush, much more green than the typical islands like Santorini and Mykonos, which are very arid, very dry. The Ionian Islands are they look very Italian, and that's partly because of their geography. They're near Italy. They're far to the north, so they have a very different feel and a lush look to them. There are lots of forests with cypress trees, evergreens, oaks, and actually on the right, this is from one of the museums I visited. Kumquats are actually a big specialty of the island as well, where you can buy all kinds of different kumquat products, the fruits and fresh fruit, but it's also made into marmalade. They make delicious liqueur out of kumquats. They make soap and other healthcare products and so forth. And of course, like pretty much everywhere in Greece, you will see olive trees. The olive groves are everywhere. The statistic I read was that there are somewhere around 4 million olive trees on the island of Corfu. Although in talking to people this year, uh, there was a lot of drought throughout much of the Mediterranean, and Greece suffered through it as well. So it was not a particularly good year for olives. So we'll see what the harvest ends up, how successful the harvest ends up being. I'm going to start in the capital of the city, which is where most people spend most of their time, particularly if you're there on a cruise ship. This is where you would dock. And a lot of people see only the city, which is fine. It's where we stayed. It's called Corfu Town. And what we're looking at here is a model that I think shows the city quite nicely. It's in a museum, an old mansion called Mon Repos, which I'll show you in a little bit. The city is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and has about 40,000 of the 100,000 or so people who live on the island. And I should point out here, if you can see way over at the top, this is the airport, which is extremely close to the town. Although the air traffic really isn't a big deal. It's not like you would notice it. But you can also very clearly here see the historic old town, which is surrounded by the fortress walls, fortifications, the main fortress, and then the old town, which is where you would spend most of your time as a visitor, where all the sites are, is this area here. And then outside of the old walls, the newer city, the more modern town is spreading. This is the same thing, just looking from the other direction, but it, I think, more clearly shows the fortress with its two hills, which is where you get Corfu. Like I said, these are the two hills from which the name Corfu derives, in Italian by way of English by way of Italian. And you can also see what's called the new fortress, which is also still pretty old, but newer than the old fortress. And also along here is the modern port, which is where the cruise ships will dock. It's where, if you take any kind of day trips or excursion boats, that's where you would probably leave from. The city is actually beautiful. It's like a stage set. There are endless narrow streets and lots of Venetian style architecture, and that's because for a very long period of time, Corfu was under different Mediterranean powers, but probably the most important one was the Venetians. Here is the old fort, which is probably the main tourist site for most visitors who come to the city, and it does loom over the whole city. It's separated by a small inlet, and you can look directly across to the Greek mainland. That's what you see in the distance. This particular ship was there while we were staying in the town. This is called the Black Pearl, which is a yacht that we found out was owned, big surprise, owned by a Russian oligarch. It was there for several of the days that we were in the city. And it's a beautiful place for strolling. There's a little 16th century church, very pretty, right along the harbor front, and looking north up the coast. But strolling the city is beautiful because it's actually an extremely Italian streetscape. It feels much more Italian than it does Greek. So the Italian style buildings, Italian style churches, you can see one of the steeples in the background, but of course the culture is Greek. The Venetians ruled the island for about 400 years, so that's why you can see their influence everywhere. And unusually for Greece, the Ottomans never really were in power on Corfu. So that's why, unlike many of the other parts of Greece that we've visited in other programs, you don't really see much of the Ottoman influence there. It really feels much more like Italy. Here's a better look at that steeple, one of more than 30 churches sprinkled through the old town. And right along the park that's in the center of the city, the most stylish area of the city, is called the Liston, which is an arcaded stretch of several blocks that were all built at the same time in the same design, that has marble paving in front of it. Now they have beautiful cafes and elegant restaurants and hotels. The name Liston is kind of interesting because there's a couple of different theories from where it comes from. There's one theory that says that it refers to the marble pavement that's in on the street in front of it. The other is that it comes from the Italian word lista, like list in English, because it was the place to be seen, to see other people, to stroll. If you were one of the elite of the city, um, the nobility of the city or of the island, this is where you would stroll. And in fact, only the elite would have been allowed to parade around in this area. So it's not entirely clear which of those theories is correct. There's actually a number of historically Venetian cities throughout Italy and throughout the Adriatic that have similar stretches in their cities called, and they use the same name, the Liston. But nowadays in Corfu, it's just an extremely elegant place to walk, particularly at night when all the lamps are lit up. I'll show you pictures of that in a little bit. And this whole area fronts onto a major park in between the Liston and the fortress. Is a big public park. It has a cricket pitch because that dates back to the time when it was under the control of the British. Here's a monument to, speaking of the British, this is Sir Thomas Maitland, a High Commissioner during the 50 or so years in the beginning of the 19th century when Corfu was controlled by the British. And here's some, it seems like a stereotype, but it's actually quite true. All over the city, you will see laundry picturesquely drying on the little narrow streets. And the architecture is just beautiful. This is an old theater that was built way back in the 1600s, but it's now used as the modern town hall for Corfu Town. And we stayed in a nice little old apartment on the top floor of one of the historic houses. So we had a terrific view out over the city and along the streets. Back to the fort, which you can clearly see here, the two peaks that I referred to. And if you visit it, you're going to cross this bridge, which goes over the moat connecting, that separates it from the mainland. And it's an enormous place. Better seen here, where you can see some boats down in the little moat. The Venetians rebuilt this fortress from an earlier one that dated back to the 15th century. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. It was a Byzantine fortress, and then in the 15th century, the Venetians came in and substantially renovated and extended this fortress. And at least 3 times, I believe, the Ottomans laid siege to the city, as they did to much of the rest of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, but they never succeeded in actually breaking down the defenses of this fortress, which is why you don't see any Ottoman influence here. If you climb to the top of the fortress, you get a wonderful view back over from the summit where there's a lighthouse at the top. You get an epic view back over the city. You can see the wide esplanade with its park, and the Liston that I just referred to earlier is this stretch kind of here along the right. And you can see some cruise ships off in the background. But the views from the top are fantastic, particularly in nice weather, which we were fortunate to have for most of the time we were there. This is looking back east towards the Greek coast and the Albanian coast also, very close by. And the modern port where you can see cruise ships coming to visit. There is also on this fortress, in the 1700s, roughly, there was an enormous munitions explosion, which did a lot of damage to the fortress. So then the British came in and did even more renovations and rebuilt it. And part of the renovations that they did was in the 1840s, they built this replica, essentially, of a Greek temple, the style of an ancient Doric temple from 500 BC, but it's a modern Christian church. And inside, it's quite pretty. and unusually bright for an Orthodox church. It's a very serene area. They have concerts there. It's a very beautiful spot, and unusual to see that exposed right in the middle of such a huge fortress. This is a view looking back from the north. And exploring the city, I'll take you down a few of the little streets. This is a charming square with another Venetian era monument. This is a well for fresh water in the city with a church, one of the churches along the side. And just the little details that you see walking around the city are delightful. There's a couple of main streets that are very touristy with all kinds of shops selling different kinds of crafts and products and so forth. But it's worth it for you to just explore down the little narrow streets and get lost. This was a cat watching us while we ate a quite nice lunch. I'm going to show you some food in a minute. I have completely forgotten which church this is, but it is very typical of the style of bell tower that you see all over Corfu Island, as well as the elaborate interior decoration that's typical of a Greek Orthodox church that was built during that time period. This picture could have been taken in Italy. It's a Vespa. And again, it's a reminder of just how very Italian Corfu feels. It was very odd for me to be in a place that felt like I was in Italy, but hearing Greek and seeing Greek food and Greek restaurants and Greek language all over the place. Here's a place that we stopped. I'll show you a lot of food as I usually do through the presentation because you have to stop for food. And Greece was once again, according to some chart, was listed as the top cuisine in the world. And you're not going to get any argument from me. But there is actually a distinct Corfu cuisine because it's Greek, but because of the influence of Italy being so close, you'll find that there are influences from Italy in the food as well. In this case, though, we have souvlaki with roasted potatoes, a delicious cabbage salad served on a trendy little piece of wood, olive wood. Here's just another typical street with a typical bell tower. One of the things that you can buy if you like these sorts of things is sponges. Sponge diving is common in much of the Mediterranean. Here are regular sponges and also loofahs. I showed you earlier the town hall that had originally been built as a theater. This is a sculpture that's on the back of it. And again, looking at this, if I didn't tell you we were in Greece, you might easily assume that we were somewhere in Italy. Much of the old town is pedestrianized, which makes it a beautiful place to stroll around. This is one of the main streets lined with restaurants and shops. It's typical Mediterranean cafe culture, and also in the evening, you can eat on the street. We were there in October when the weather was still perfectly pleasant. It's comfortable but not cold at night. And there's a little bit of new and old in Corfu as well. There are lots of trendy boutiques, but I didn't find Corfu Town to be totally gentrified, which was very nice. Some places like this can almost feel like Disney versions of themselves, and Corfu was not like that. There are still plenty of locals who live and go about their lives in the city, although clearly, particularly compared to a number of other areas of Greece, Corfu is wealthy. And Corfu Town in particular certainly shows off its wealth. It's not a cheap place to live. This is one of the biggest squares in the town, and it has this old bank building which has now been converted into a museum of kind of the history of Greek money. So you'll see exhibits of currency and banknotes, which is interesting if you're into that sort of thing. Another typical street. And of course, there are Plenty of places to explore with arched passageways and narrow little places that come out into squares. This glorious church on the left is the Metropolitan Cathedral, which is a 16th century church that was rebuilt a couple hundred years later. It has this wonderful facade that with a stairway that goes down to the port. On the right is the old synagogue. And like other parts of Greece, there was a Jewish population on the island before World War II, and not a huge one, maybe about 2,000 strong in that time period. And of course, under the Nazi occupation of Greece during World War II, they were all deported, and now there are only about 60 and barely big enough to have a congregation. And this former synagogue is actually now used as a school building, which is unfortunately a sorry typical story of a lot of parts of the Mediterranean because of World War II. This is the courthouse. And I would be remiss to do any kind of presentation on Corfu without talking about the Durrells. For those of you who don't know, they were a very well-known English family who lived on Corfu for a number of years. They were repopularized recently because there was a really good series on public television, Masterpiece Theater. They did a series from, I think, about 2016 to 19. I think there were at least 3 or 4 seasons that covered the time that the family was there during the 1930s, right before World War II broke out. 2 of the Durrells' children, there were 4, 3 boys and 2, 2 girls, 2 boys. Anyway, 2 of them became very famous writers, Gerald and Lawrence, who actually have monuments right in the square down near the fortress. Lawrence Durrell was mostly a fiction writer, and in fact, he's considered one of the best British novelists of the 20th century. Gerald, his younger brother, was more famous as a nonfiction writer. He wrote, probably his most famous work is called My Family and Other Animals, which is a very humorous take on their life, the family life when they were living on Corfu. And he became a naturalist. So if you're interested in the Durrells and have read any, I would highly recommend them just for reading because they're terrific writers. But if you're interested in the family or are looking for something to watch, the series I believe is still available on, I'm forgetting whether it's Netflix or maybe Amazon Prime, but it is available on streaming services. And it was filmed on Corfu, so you can see a lot of the film locations. And in fact, if you go there, there are places like this store which will take you on tours to visit all of the places that they either lived in real life or places that were part of the film series. In fact, this is a place we stopped maybe half an hour north of the town in a very small cove called, this is called the White House. And this is where Lawrence Durrell lived with his wife, Nancy, in real life, not in the TV show. This was actually their house. And it's been turned into a very chic restaurant, and you can even stay there overnight if you book way ahead of time. Here's a little monument, a plaque commemorating it. The other place that you can't really visit because you can only peek through the fence like I've done here. This is very close to the town. In a suburb just north is the house where the series, the PBS series, was filmed. It's a beautiful spot. Unfortunately, it's very close to a busy road. You'd never know that from the television series. It's called the Villa Posillipo, and it was built around 1700 or so, literally like right on the waterfront. And if you want to, you can stay there. It starts at about 2,000 euros per day. And you have to rent the whole house. You can't rent a room. So if you, it sleeps, I think, 10 people. And you'd obviously have to book it way in advance. But if you have a bunch of well-off friends, you can even stay there. If you want to, you can stay there. If you want to, you can stay there. If you have a bunch of well-off friends, you can even stay there. If you have a bunch of well-off friends, you can even stay there. If you have a bunch of well-off friends, you can even stay there. If you have a bunch of well-off friends, who want to stay on Corfu, you can book the whole place for a week for 2,000 a day, and enjoy the same luxury that the Durrells enjoyed back when they were there. It is a beautiful spot. Speaking of tourism, it's worth it just to mention kind of where Corfu is on the tourist map these days, which is it's very high on the list for cruise ship destinations in the Mediterranean. And I was surprised also to discover not just cruise ships, but the bulk of arrivals actually come by plane, which I was surprised at. Corfu gets about 2 million visitors per year. And that's just by air. That doesn't include all of the 200,000 or so passengers that arrive by cruise ship. And after Santorini and Mykonos, it is the third largest, third most visited cruise port in Greece. So, and of course, as you can see from here, this was a tourist shop that sold guidebooks in umpteen different languages to give you an idea of there are tourists coming from all over the place. And as a result, like a number of places in the world that you've probably heard about recently, they might be feeling just a little bit over-touristed. And I did see that when we were there. I wouldn't say I was disappointed in Corfu by any means, but we were struck certainly by the degree of development and what I might even call overdevelopment on the island. Not in the city itself, which is it's a historic city, but the place where you would notice the development is the many villas that are being built elsewhere all over the island. And they are not necessarily in a traditional island style. Many of them are very modern with glass and concrete, and so the island is definitely suffering from that in some places. But you can see here from the graffiti that there's a certain sense of maybe being a victim of its own success. Personally, I certainly didn't feel that walking around as a tourist. Part of that is because we were there off season, but even in October, it was pretty crowded. There are plenty of people there, but I would definitely avoid it during June, July, August. It must be a nightmare and completely overrun with people. This was a wonderful little church that I kept trying to visit, but it was never open. The guidebook kept saying we should visit this church, so I don't know what it looks like inside. But it was in a cute little neighborhood full of full of motorcycles. I love actually, that's not true. I don't love shopping. I love going to markets in foreign countries, not to actually buy tourist stuff. But I just enjoy seeing what kinds of things are for sale, particularly in local markets where the locals are doing their shopping. Here you can see some kumquats. Obviously, there's a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables on the island. And there's also expensive boutiques. I'm not sure how classy this is, but you know, it is a fancy island. Everywhere, particularly in the city, I would say it's almost impossible to take a photograph without it being Instagrammable. Here's another incredible interior of a Baroque church, a stylish restaurant along the street. And there's just wonderful architecture everywhere. This is an old mansion that's been now recently restored and overlooks the esplanade. There's also a number of really, really good museums on the island, mostly in the city. This one is now a museum of Asiatic art, but it was originally built in the early 1800s by Commissioner Maitland, if you remember the monument that we saw earlier. It was built as the Palace of St. Michael and St. George, and it was during the period of British rule. So it was the seat of the government during that time period, as well as the residence where Maitland lived. And so it's very neoclassical, looks out over the esplanade, and it has been now turned into this museum of of Asian art. When Corfu became part of the modern Greek nation, which wasn't until 1864, it was at that point used by the king as a royal residence when he visited the island. So now instead, it is an incredible museum of Asian art. Those of us who live in the Boston area, it may not seem as incredible because the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has unbelievable Asiatic collections. But for Europe and for certainly in Greece, this is one of the most incredible collections of Asian art I've seen anywhere. Impressive collections from all over Asia, not just China, Japan, Korea, places like that, but also Central Asia, South Asia. It's very well organized and has just spectacular collections. The building itself is also worth visiting just because you can see the magnificent staterooms from back when it was a government building. This is the rotunda and the grand staircase. And the throne room back when Greece still had a king. And he would preside here. The other big museum to see is at the opposite end of the spectrum, albeit in a much less impressive, kind of ugly building from the 1960s, is the Archaeological Museum. They have this ginormous rosemary plant right in front of the entrance. And it's not a huge museum, which is nice because you don't feel like you have to spend all day being overwhelmed by ancient art. This is the most famous piece in the museum called the Gorgon pediment from a temple that no longer exists, although you can see the location where it was. It's actually very close to the airport. There was a very early temple to the goddess Artemis on the island, built in the 6th century BC. And here you can see, this is a closer up view of the pediment. And unusually for a pediment, this is Medusa, fleeing from Perseus, who, if you remember in mythology, he's the one who beheaded Medusa with the help of the gods. And after he chopped off her head, her two children, one was Pegasus, the winged horse, and the other was Chrysaor, who was a giant, essentially. He's less well known, as well as two panthers that you can see on the side. So it's a very unusual subject matter for a pediment. This is a recreation of what it might have looked like back in the day. And of course, it would have been brightly painted, as would have been the rest of the temple. The reason why maybe Medusa on a temple front, it's who knows for real. But the predominant theory is that Artemis was a goddess who was very much connected with animal life. She was the huntress, so perhaps Medusa and her connection with animals, who knows exactly why this was the design, but that may explain the subject matter. The other big thing that they have in this museum is a lion. This is the other real prize exhibit of this small museum. It's one of the earliest animal tomb sculptures. The tomb is actually only a couple of blocks away from the museum and was a memorial to an ancient official in the late 7th century BC called Menecrates. And you can still see the tomb, which there's not much there to see now, but this sculpture would have originally graced that tomb. And there's some really other incredible things in the museum, some of the more impressive things. This is a bronze Hercules and a terracotta burial urn, which was used for children. They actually buried children in that time period in sort of fetal positions inside these clay pots. But on a slightly more enjoyable note, it's time for dinner. So I'm going to mention a couple of things that are very typical Corfu foods for dinner. One is called pastizzata, which is a beef stew. That's the one here on the left. Pastizzata is a very comfort food, rich beef stew, usually served over pasta. And the other one is called sofrito. Kind of see it a little bit in the back. Sofrito is veal, which is made in a kind of it's a white wine sauce, but it has a little bit of vinegar in it and garlic. Again, usually served with potatoes, and this is a cabbage salad. Uh, and of course, you're going to wash it down with wine. This is one of the main shopping streets in the city, very nicely pedestrianized. And the other fortress, called the New Fortress, which is also worth a visit if you have the time. It's very grim, very imposing, kind of the point, and it presides over the modern port. The main reason I think for visiting this fortress is, unless you're really into military history, the main reason is the views. This is another one that was built by the Venetians and expanded over time by the French and the British at different times in history. Most of what you see here is from the early 1800s. But again, the main reason I think that you might want to trek all the way to the top is there's an absolutely spectacular view over the city. We're looking east back towards the mainland, where you can see the old fortress and the historic city with all its gorgeous Mediterranean colors. We were there, I believe, on a Sunday morning. So we also were serenaded by all the church bells that were going off at the same time. It was just magical. The structure has a lot of cannon emplacements and the narrow slits from which they could shoot from. If you're traveling there with children, this is obviously one of the kinds of places that's perfect for kids to explore, because it's got lots of narrow passageways that they can look around. This is the small wooded island right off the coast called Tihia, or also known as Vidos. And it was used as a base when the Ottomans were trying to attack the city. But more recently, it's better known as a place where over 1,200 Serbian soldiers were defending the island during the 20th century. And they died there was a hospital on the island, and many of the Serbian soldiers died in horrible conditions. Now there is a mausoleum in their memory, and you can visit the island with a boat excursion if you want. And also looking north a little further away, you can see Mount Pantokratoras, which is the highest point on the island. We're going to visit that in just a bit. As night falls, the sky turns soft and beautiful. These are some views from our apartment. Oops, sorry. Looking out over that's looking east, and looking west over the rooftops to the sunset. And the setting sun warms all of the stones. This is one of the joys of visiting the Mediterranean, is when the sun goes down, all of the limestone buildings turn just beautiful colors. And then at night, we were there during the full moon, which was a nice time to be there. So everything gets lit up. The moon was, it was even a super moon while we were there, which was pretty impressive. And it completely lights up the ocean, glistening on the water. This is the Liston that I mentioned earlier, absolutely splendid at night due to the old lamps that are lit up. And just like it was in the old days, it reflects off of the polished marble, and it's the place where, if you're Italian, you call it the passeggiata, but no matter what culture you're from, it's where you stroll either before or after dinner. It's where you go to see and be seen. Which we basically had to do every night. And it's an excuse also to get an ice cream afterwards, after dinner. But not just that area, all over the city, there are many buildings that get lit up. This is that old bank that I referred to earlier that's now a museum about currency in its piazza. And even the old bandstand on the Esplanade gets lit up. And the Maitland Monument. And the streets come alive with cafe culture. The bars and the tavernas stay open very late at night for dinner and drinks. But there are still plenty of places where you can find peace and quiet on little alleyways that have nobody on them, and all you'll hear is footsteps echoing down the passageways. Here's some more food. Time for dinner. We stumbled on this completely out of the way restaurant, which I think was called Corfu Restaurant for some reason, which is a completely unimaginative name. But they had absolutely delicious food. And like many of the restaurants, the tables just kind of spill out onto the street because that's the only place there's room. So on the left are some delicious tiropitas, cheese pies with a Greek salad. I had a wonderful lamb stew, and I forget what this was, but another kind of stew. There's a lot of really good comfort food um, that you can get there, and just more scenes of the city at night. This is the old town hall lit up in its platea. But enough of the city. I need to get you out into the countryside. We visited a friend and a fellow student. I take Greek language lessons, and a student that's part of my Zoom conversation group. She's American, but married a Greek and now lives in a house that they built on Corfu. So we stopped and visited them in the little village of Pelekas, which is about 30 minutes west of the town. It's actually on the opposite coast. So this is their terrace. Here we are. Amy is American, and she and her husband built this absolutely gorgeous house in his home village. So from if you hike up to the top of the village, there's a wonderful panorama view that looks down the coast. This is a peak called Kaiser's Throne. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. It's named for the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. He spent summers on Corfu for a number of years and built an observatory on this peak. So that's why it's still named for him. But the view out over the island is incredible. This is looking back. There's 360 views, but you can see we're looking back towards the mainland, looking towards the east, where you can see Corfu Town and the fortress about 8 miles away, and the Greek mainland is off in the distance. In the middle of their village is this, it's now used as a planter, but this is an old mine that was found off the coast and deactivated and turned into a planter in the middle of the village. Driving on Corfu is somewhat challenging. If you go to the island and are planning to explore, you really do need a car because it's pretty big. There is a very good public transit system, an extensive bus system. The only problem with the buses is that they tend to be rather slow. So unless you have a lot of time, you're limited by the bus schedule and what particular places they go. So I would recommend driving. The only problem with driving is you're also going to very likely get stuck behind a bus because the roads are very narrow. Here is another view. One of the most visited sites on the whole island is called Paleokastrica, which is on the west coast. It is said to be the place where Odysseus landed on his lengthy odyssey all the way back after the Trojan War. And he met Nafsika and was trapped on the island for many years. Of course, this is all conjectural. No one knows exactly where Odysseus, assuming all of that wasn't completely fictional, but this is one of many places that claims some connection to Homer's Odyssey. And certainly in terms of beauty, it fits the bill. This is Paleokastrica with its monastery. We tried to visit and were completely daunted because the traffic was insane. I couldn't believe how many cars there were. Parking was next to impossible. And as it turns out, we were there when the monastery was closed. So we gave up. The monastery is from the 13th century, and it's supposed to be really quite the place to visit. But it was just too much trouble. So what we did instead is drove up the coast. And if you drive up the mountain, behind the tour buses, you can see fantastic views up and down the west coast, looking back down to the monastery. And what we enjoyed far more was a place called Angelocastro, which is just a little bit to the north, and it's an old castle, ruined castle fortress, which has far fewer visitors. In fact, almost no visitors. And you can climb up to the top. This is from the Byzantine time period. It's 1,000 feet up on the cliff, and was a very important location for defending against the Ottomans. So now you can explore the extensive ruins. It's well worth the climb, certainly for seeing the incredible views up and down the coast to the Ionian Sea. There's some very well-marked explanatory panels that talk about the history of the castle. This is looking north and looking back down south. And you can just see Paleokastrica here. And the dramatic west coast for which the island is famous. One interesting thing that I have never seen in any of the places I've visited from ruins in Greece from this time period. The castle, like I said, goes back to the 13th century, I think. And at the top, there's a little chapel to the Archangel Michael. And in front of it are 7 graves, see them here, literally dug into the hard rock. They are exactly the right size for a person. No one knows exactly when or why they were created, but they are obviously tombs of some kind. The peak that the castle is on is also completely covered with olive groves, which makes it a very pleasant place to stroll, particularly if it's very hot. And there's also a cave chapel, in addition to the chapel on top of the rock. There's another one dug into the rock underneath to St. Kyriaki. And so it's a tiny little cave chapel with the altar inside. So if you go there and find the tourists, crowds of tourists a little overwhelming, this was a wonderful place to escape, because you can get the same spectacular scenery with nobody to bother you. If you continue up the northwest coast, you get a view of the sweeping bay of Ios Yorgos, with its crescent of sand. And then way off in the distance, you can see a group of small offshore islands called the Diapontians. There are very few people there, only about 400 on all of them. The largest one, way off in the distance, is called Othoni and is said to be by Homer. This is another one where when Odysseus was heading back towards Ithaca, Ogygia is the island where Calypso kept him captive. And this is one of the islands that claims to be that location. It also happens to be the westernmost point in all of Greece, this little offshore island. And if you keep going up the coast, at the extreme northwest of the island is Cape Thrastis, which has these brilliant white limestone rock formations that contrast with the vivid blue of the sea. You can visit by boat, or there's a short hike from a parking area, but it's a little dangerous, so you have to be careful to stay on the paths. But the views are absolutely worth it. It's some of the best scenery on the whole island. This is looking precipitously straight down several hundred feet to the ocean. It's also obviously, because of the location at the northwest corner, it's a perfect spot for visiting the sunset, for seeing the sunset, if you get there at the right time. Not too far away. Unfortunately, we went back on a day that was a little more cloudy, but there's a similar dramatic formation called the Canal d'Amour, the Canal of Love, which is a narrow cove that's perfect for swimming. And unfortunately, what you can't see from this picture is that it is completely surrounded by tacky restaurants and hotels. So if you can ignore that and look only towards the ocean, you will see these beautiful rock formations with brilliant blue water. But it's kind of, it's definitely over touristed at this point. You can go diving from the rocks. The reason it's called the Canal d'Amour is supposedly if you swim the length of it, you will meet the love of your life. Um, but if nothing else, there's plenty of places to eat and plenty of places to sleep. Back in town, here's some more food. We went to one of the nicer restaurants in the square where the town hall is located and had some delicious salads. And also, this is one of the local specialties I mentioned earlier called sofrito. That's the veal made with sort of white wine vinegar sauce. And also some mushroom risotto. Risotto, of course, is a very Italian food, but much of the cuisine on Corfu is heavily influenced by Italy, including panna cotta for dessert. Some of the things you might want to visit as you're traveling around the island, very close to Corfu Town, is there's some mansions because this was a place where back in the 19th century, very wealthy Europeans, including royalty, went to enjoy the pleasant weather. And this one is called Mon Repos, French for my rest, was built. This is a mansion that was built by the same architect who built that big palace that's now the Asian Art Museum. And he built it for another official, a later government official. And it has been turned into a museum. It was also, I believe, another of the filming locations for the series about the Durrells that I mentioned. It's surrounded by beautiful gardens and a forest. The museum itself is very nice, very neoclassical Regency style building with some of the original furnishings and a beautiful view out over the sea to the Greek mainland. But it's also worth wandering through the forest, which at the time we were there was filled with fall cyclamens, which are the ones that you'd get here as a house plant are very big. In Greece, they're very common in the fall, just tiny little miniature ones that carpet the forests. And this forest has some very nice walking paths and biking paths. It also is a forest that's full of ancient ruins because this was the location of ancient Kythera. So way back in say the 5th century BC, this was the location of the prime settlement on the island. And this is this mansion in the center of this park is another one of the places that was used as a royal residence after Corfu became part of the modern Greek nation state. It also has some famous connections as well. Prince Philip of England, the one was husband of Queen Elizabeth. He died just, I don't know, a couple of years ago. He was actually born, believe it or not, on the dining room table in that mansion in 1921, which is one of the odder historical tidbits about the island. But this is called Paleopolis, the original settlement from as far back as the 8th century BC, although much of what you see here is a couple centuries later. And it is a very nice archaeological site that you can stroll around now where you can see the ancient ruins, as well as a temple to the goddess Hera. Not too far away, just down the coast at the tip of the peninsula near the airport, is the picturesque little monastery of Panagia Vlacherna, which is reached by a little causeway. You can walk out on the causeway. And the little islet in the back is called Mouse Island, Pontikonisi. You can, for just a couple euros, you can take a boat out there. And it has another tiny little monastery, but not much else. But it is very pretty. Or you can watch the planes. You're literally next to the airport, so you can watch the planes taking off and landing very close by. The other big site to see on this historic site, I should say, on this side of the island, a few more miles down the east coast, this is the traditional village of Aideca on the mountainside, but it's very close to a palace called the Achilleon Palace, which was built in 1888 by the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Austro-Hungary. She fell in love with the island, built this spectacular palace. She was also obsessed with Greek history, Greek mythology. She's better known as Sisi. You may have heard of her historically referred to by that name. And so the design of the palace and indeed the name, the Achilleon, is a reference to the hero Achilles. And she designed it deliberately for that purpose, as sort of a monument to Greek mythology and to him. This is actually a somewhat ghostly statue of Elizabeth at the main entrance. And there are mythological sculptures all around. Unfortunately, right now, the building is in very tough shape, and there is you can only visit the gardens. These are a couple of photographs showing what the interior looks like. They are doing a massive multi-year restoration of the building and the gardens. So most of the gardens have been restored at this point. I think it's 18 million euros they were spending, part of a big EU cultural project. But it's been going on for several years, and eventually, it's not quite clear when they're going to finish, but eventually they will reopen the interior of the palace as well. But right now you can only view the exterior, where there are a number of very famous sculptures, classical statues that Sisi collected, including these bronze athletes. And also one of the most famous is this marble statue of the dying Achilles by a late 19th century German sculptor, which was recently cleaned and restored to its original condition. And the biggest statue is at the very end of the terrace, looking north towards the town of Corfu, several miles distant, is this monumental bronze that the Empress actually commissioned for this location. It stands about 30 feet high if you go all the way to the tip of his spear. After Elizabeth's death, the palace was eventually bought by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. And after he died, it went through several lives. It was an orphanage for a while. It was a casino for a while. It was a military hospital for a while. Now it's owned by the tourism ministry. So that's hence all of the restoration to make it a major tourist site. One of the areas that has been restored is the Stoa of the Muses, which is a beautiful terrace overlooking the ocean. That's has a whole gallery of statues of the 9 muses from ancient mythology, along with a number of other mythological figures as well. And just a picture postcard view out over the forest and the sea. In the other direction, if we go north from the city, you can and should definitely make a trip to the very highest point on the island, which is Mount Pantokratoras, 3,000 feet up. You can hike if you want. There's a lot of good hiking, but if you prefer, you can drive, although you can see even the drive is somewhat tortuous. But you're rewarded at the top with views in all directions. We're looking towards Albania here, over towards the coast on the mainland. And you can also look all the way back down towards Corfu Town. On a clear day, they say you can see Italy, but I think it would have to be exceptionally clear to see Italy. But certainly you can see the town itself. In fact, you can clearly see the airport off in the distance, and the cruise ship port as well. There are a number of cell phone towers and other kinds of antennas at the top, which is understandable given how high it is. So it bristles with all these antennas, but it's kind of a shame because it spoils the view. But the other thing to see at the top is the monastery, which is absolutely gorgeous. The only problem is they've put this enormous telecom tower right smack in the middle of the monastery. I hope the monastery is getting a good amount of revenue out of that. But here, the landscape around, because we're up so high, the landscape is much less lush, much more rocky and barren than it would be at lower altitudes. But the monastery, it's small, late 17th century, but absolutely exquisite. The church is this tiny little jewel box, completely covered with glorious frescoes and icons. And of course, the view is this is looking north. The view is just stupendous in every direction. Um, Regardless of whether you've hiked or climbed, fortunately, there is a restaurant and cafe at the top so that you can get refreshed if you need to. This is looking down at an old abandoned village called Signes, which I really wanted to see, and I'm making note of it now because I want to come back to it in just a little bit. But this is looking, as you come back down the mountain, this is again looking south towards the open bay where the town is located. We treated ourselves to a very fancy seafood restaurant that was supposed to have amazing reviews, and it really was good. So here I am wearing my octopus shirt and eating my octopus appetizer, which was among the best octopus I've ever had, I do have to say. And they had some really good different kinds of local fish as well. This is delicious fresh fish that you can actually choose your own fish. They serve it in a beautiful outdoor garden that's kind of hidden behind the restaurant. I had a fish called croaker, which is actually, it's a Mediterranean fish, but it's also an Atlantic fish, although you don't find it so much in the United States. It's a very, very delicious, delicate white meat fish. And the name comes from the fact that I guess the fish itself makes a very loud noise underwater. And some dessert, of course, as well. A little more exploration on the west coast, heading south. This is an area that is full of lots of little beach coves. It's a very wild side of the island, not quite as touristy. Most of the villages here are small beach towns, no huge resorts, and lots of little sheltered beaches and interesting rock formations. There's a stretch quite far south that has several miles of sandy beach, which is kind of unusual in Greece. And behind the dunes is a very large lagoon covering several thousand acres, which is now a protected wetland area. So it's very good for bird watching, depending on the time of year that you're there. It's a big migratory spot because of the wetlands. So it was the wrong time of year for flamingos, but you will find a lot of interesting endemic plants, fish, more than 120 species of birds that are native to the area or that stop there on their way to and from Europe back and forth to Africa. So when we were there, there were just a few egrets. And there's beautiful views strolling around through the dunes. You can walk. It's a very nice area if you want to get into some nature. Going up the northeast coast, around the other side, the other bend, there's also a number of beautiful little coves and villages looking towards Albania. This is where Corfu comes closest, barely a mile and a half from the Albanian coast. This is a beach called Ipsos. And a charming little village called Cassiope. And one of the reasons we went up in this area, because I was determined to explore that abandoned village that I pointed out that you could see down from the top of the mountain. So we followed the road up to the mountains, only to find that we were at the wrong abandoned village. The one that we ended up at, which is called Perithia, is indeed partly abandoned, but hardly unknown. In fact, it was massively full of tourists. There was a huge parking lot with tons of visitors, and you can explore the old town. It is the oldest permanently inhabited village on the island, going back to the 14th century. It's built quite a ways inland in order to be safe from pirates. So it does have a number of crumbling houses, abandoned churches, but abandoned, it's not abandoned. There are people all over the place. There are actually a few people who are restoring the houses and numerous busy tavernas. But nonetheless, it was still a fun place to explore. It used to be one of the wealthiest villages on the island, had 130 houses, but during the 20th century, it just kind of disappeared and everyone left. But now people are starting to come back. And it was kind of like after World War II, people drifted away to more prosperous and lively places along the coast because this really is up in the mountains. But things are changing, and the pendulum is swinging back. And although it's got a very haunting atmosphere if you want to get that kind of abandoned feel. It really is. It was quite crowded the day we were there. So what I would really like to do is someday go back and find the other really abandoned village, which is much harder to get to because it turns out you have to take a fairly lengthy hike to get to it. We are on the back side of the mountain that we were on the top of. In fact, you can see the monastery and the telecom tower way up at the top. But it's a picturesque place. There are definitely signs of life still there. We stopped. I just liked this. I called him Jesus of the recycling bins because just outside of the village was the area where people stopped to put their garbage in their recycling, and this was right next to the roadside. To finish the program, I want to talk about an excursion that is well worth taking if you have enough time when you're on Kerkera. And that's where this is looking east. We're getting up very early in the morning, just as the sun is rising, to take a boat trip. There were a couple of cruise ships getting ready to depart while we were there. But we took a trip to the nearby islands of Paxos and Antipaxos, which are maybe 10, 15 miles south of the southern tip of Corfu. This is passing the fortress. It's fun to take a boat trip, if only to see Corfu from the sea, because it's a very different perspective and a more historic one, because that's how you would have originally approached the island. So these two islands, in Greek, they are known in plural as Paxi, the two islands together. They are the smallest of the 7 main Ionian islands, which are called the Heptanisi, 7 islands. And going from north to south, it's Corfu, Paxi, Lefkada, Ithaki, Kefalonia, Zakynthos, and Kythera, if you go all the way down the Ionian coast, starting from the top. So here's Corfu. And if this is maybe 10 miles or so south, you get to the two, Paxos and Antipaxos. This is a view of them from the air. They're very small, very rocky, like Corfu, not as tall, but they have the same kind of geology with coves and cliffs and hidden little beaches. They're much less visited for obvious reasons, although that's changing. And I'm going to recommend another thing that you might want to watch. There's a new series on Netflix, the first of the international Netflix series to be filmed in Greece. And it's called Maestro. In English, it's called Maestro in Blue. There are 2 seasons. And they were filmed on Corfu, and for the most part, they were filmed here on these 2 islands as well. So if you have Netflix, they're in Greek, but with subtitles. And it's the scenery is gorgeous. The acting is good. The music is good. And it's a great story about the history of a little village that has a mystery and families with secrets and so forth. So if you have a chance to watch it, it's well worth it. This is a passing. You remember we visited the mansion called Mon Repos. This is looking at it from the ocean. You can go on a tour. You can take a ferry. There are different ways to get there. There's regularly scheduled ferry service. We took a tour because It was just an easier way to spend the whole day there, and also have time to go swimming. But you get a beautiful view of the island of Corfu as you're working your way down the coast. And then once you leave the southernmost tip of Corfu, you arrive at Paxos, where you can see um, similar kinds of landscape to what you would see on the west coast of Corfu, with just these hidden little coves, very dramatic cliffs, and there's a lot of sea caves. In fact, the smaller the boat that you have, you can actually get into. We went into this one here, which was called the Cave of Poseidon. It looks tiny, but when you actually get up close to it, it's a lot bigger than it looks. And the water is incredibly clear and blue, the most gorgeous Aegean. And the weather was still perfect for swimming. Even in October, even into November, you can swim. The water temperature is perfectly fine. This is our boat actually went into the cave, so this is looking out. And like Corfu, you'll see again many very elaborate and expensive villas built high up on the coast. There's a lot of hiking on the island, boating, fishing, sightseeing, to go into all these little sea caves. And then this is Antipaxos, the even tinier island, just a little bit south. It has only 20 residents, and even fewer. I think only 2 or 3 live there during the winter months. This is another weird little tidbit that I just happened to discover when I was doing some research. If any of you have ever watched the comedy series What We Do in the Shadows, you'd think it has nothing to do with Greece, but it's a comedy about vampires living in Staten Island. If you're not familiar with it, it is quite a funny show. But one of the main characters, called Natasha, this particular tiny little island is her fictional birthplace. So if you're a fan of the show, it was kind of fun to visit here. We stopped for a swim in this gorgeous cove where the water was just this unearthly shade of blue. And we were lucky to have, again, perfect weather. So even in October, certainly compared to New England, the ocean temperature is ideal for swimming. And then we also stopped and spent a little time on the larger island, Paxos, which has its little capital, which is the village of Gaios. And again, this is where the series Maestro is filmed. Much of the scenery in the show is filmed in this little teeny town. And you'll recognize, if you've seen the series, you'll recognize the promenade. It's a perfect little bay because it is protected by a tiny island called St. Nicholas Island. So the harbor, it's a perfect spot for a harbor. It's completely sheltered from the open ocean. And it has some beautiful little churches, nice places to stay, and a little square with its church looking out over the harbor, and a great place to just stop and have lunch, which of course we had to do. Unusually, though, for such a small place, it has this surprisingly monumental water cistern. For small islands all over the Mediterranean, certainly in Greece, fresh water, particularly during the summer months, it's a scarce commodity. So they have, for centuries, found creative ways of collecting and storing water. And here on this tiny little island is this enormous cistern that serves the entire island. And you can climb up to the top of it and get a view out over the town. We did stop for lunch in one of the tiny little places in a back alley. These are zucchini fritters, moussaka, stuffed peppers and tomatoes, washed down with a nice bottle of cold retsina. This island actually is much more ancient than you might think. It was originally settled by the Phoenicians, and it has maybe 2,500 people, which is pretty big for such a tiny little island. And similar architecture to what you would see in Corfu, very Italian-looking neoclassical buildings along the waterfront. Lots of places to get gelato because it's so close to Italy. And this is, if you walk all the way out to the breakwater, you get a nice view back over the harbor. This house, probably the biggest house on the waterfront, is the location where in the second season of Maestro, the investigator who comes to investigate the crime that I won't tell you about if you haven't seen it, this is the place where he stays. A beautiful old building. So I'm very sad to leave Corfu, but this is a view. We flew back to Athens. As I said, you can certainly drive there, but it's the drive, if you're coming from Athens, is quite long. So unless you're already kind of touring that part of Greece, it's easy to take a ferry, take the car ferry over, but otherwise, probably the easiest way is to take a flight. Flights are barely $100 one way, so it's an easy flight from Athens. And then you can rent a car pretty cheaply on the island. So here we are saying goodbye. This is the southern tip. You can see that lagoon where I mentioned earlier is now a big bird paradise. And the sun going down over the island. And I'm going to end with something funny because I didn't know where else to put this in my program, but I just thought it was funny, particularly for English speakers. We drove by this organization called EEK, which is funny in English, but in Greek it stands for the Εργαστήριο Ειδικής Επαγγελματικής Εκπαίδευσης και Κατάρτισης Kerkyras. And what it means is in Greek, it's essentially a vocational school for kids with special needs. There's one, and it's a whole network throughout the country, but it's particularly humorous to English speakers to see that the abbreviation for it is EEK. Anyway, so I will end the program there, and I'm going to turn off my share and just double check to see what kinds of questions we might have. Oh, only a couple. Let's see. Was there any Italian influence on the Greek dialect spoken there? Not that I noticed, but my Greek is not fluent. I speak decent Greek, but my Greek is not good enough that I can really tell the difference between dialects. Some accents, yes. Places like Crete, for example, has a very distinct dialect. Cypriot Greek is extremely different. And those I would be able to recognize. But the Greek that I heard spoken in Corfu was pretty much the same kind of Greek that I would have noticed elsewhere. But that's a good question for me to ask my Greek friends who have traveled there, whether because they would be much better attuned to local accents than I would be. Let's see what other question. Please repeat the name of the series that was filmed. Okay, the two series that I mentioned. The one about the Durrells is just called The Durrells in Corfu, I think is all it is. That's just what it's called. And there are at least 3 seasons, maybe 4. And it was a PBS masterpiece series. It's actually, you know what? Robert always sends out a follow-up email to his program. So what I'll do is I'll double check which streaming service it's available on, and I'll find a link that he can share with you. And I'll also link to some information about the authors, because if you're interested in reading their books, both of the writers in the family are superb writers. The other series that I mentioned is called Maestro. In Greek, it's Maestro. In in English on English Netflix. It's called Maestro in Blue, and it's in Greek language but with English subtitles. And I'll have Robert provide a link to that as well. What are the red flowers in the photo with the egrets? You know, I never found out. That's something I would need to figure out. They weren't really flowers. They were water plant like reeds. It was some kind of reed, but I had never seen one that was really that color red. But I don't actually know the answer to that. Is it worth it to go to Albania? Oh, absolutely. I've only been to Albania I stopped there on a small boat cruise many years ago, and visited the capital and a couple of places nearby. And Albania is it's very much opening up, and I would totally love to go back and spend more time in Albania. It's as to whether you need a visa, I don't believe you needed any special visa. It is not part of the EU. They're a long way that they've started the process of someday achieving EU membership, but it's going to be a while. But I don't believe there's any particular requirements for getting to Albania any different from any other European country. But they are not part of Schengen, and they are not part of the EU. So there's that. But Albania is actually a magnificent place to visit from what little I saw of it, and I would like to go back and explore more. Costs for food and lodging comparable to other places in other European destinations. In general, I would say Greece is cheaper than a lot of other European destinations. Having said that, Corfu is one of the more expensive parts of Greece. But compared to going to France or Italy, it's certainly not an expensive destination. It can be if you want a really nice hotel and if you want to eat in all the best restaurants. Absolutely, it can be expensive, but it doesn't have to be. We stayed, I think, for the apartment we had, which had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a spectacular view. I think, and laundry. We even had a washing machine. I think we paid around $100 a night in October, which is kind of shoulder season. Costs would obviously be higher during the summer, but you don't want to go in the summer anyway because it'll be crowded and it'll be hot. So definitely you're better off going in the spring or the fall. And if you don't speak Greek, Greece is one of the countries in Europe that has the highest percentage of English speakers, and particularly if you're traveling anywhere where there are tourists, you're not going to have any trouble on Corfu. Partly because, don't forget, for a good first half of the 19th century, Corfu was British. So there's a lot of leftover influence from Britain. And most modern Greeks, if you're under the age of 50, you certainly learned Greek in school. If you work in tourism, you definitely don't need to learn Greek. But if you make any effort to learn Greek, even like a few basic phrases, like this is my advice anytime you travel anywhere in the world, learn basic things like hello, goodbye, please, thank you, good morning, where is, and my favorite is to learn how to say your village, country, town, whatever is beautiful. People love to be complimented. People love to know that you appreciate the place that they are. So learning a few basic phrases is not hard. Greeks in particular are always impressed if you know even a few basic phrases. So I would recommend that. But if you don't speak a word of Greek, you will have no trouble in Corfu, none whatsoever. So, oh, I'm just looking at the chat. Oh, there's a whole, you know what? I missed the chat. Where did my chat go? Why can't I see that? I'm going to close my Q&A because I've completely lost the chat. Why
I
can't
don't
I
know,
see
Jeff.
it?
Do you want me to read the chat to you?
My chat window has disappeared, and I don't understand why. I can see that there are 13 things in it, but it won't show me what they are. Ah,
Oh,
there we go. Okay, sorry. Da, 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 da. Let's hit those. Uh, da, 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 da. Charles of Corfu, wonderful presentation, blah, blah, blah. In the movie, oh, Desk Set is one of my favorite movies. It's the favorite movie of anyone who's a librarian, I have to say. Katharine Hepburn has a scene with a computer that confuses Corfu with curfew. Now I have to watch Desk Set again. I love that movie. Da, 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 da. Is the driving scary? Um, well, I'm from Boston, so no, the driving's not scary. If you can drive in Boston, you can. The only thing I found difficult about driving in Corfu in particular um, is the buses. They have an extensive bus system, so there's an awful lot of buses and an awful lot of tour buses, not just like the local bus system, but you know, air-conditioned motor coaches schlepping people around from the cruise boats. So you will encounter a lot of those while you're driving on the narrow roads. But most of the cliff roads actually do have guardrails. I don't think I would worry about that. But if you're a timid driver, then maybe it's not the place for you to rent a car. But um, it really isn't that bad. And it is definitely the best way to get around the island. I guess that's all the questions. So I encourage you to go. I encourage you to go off season or shoulder season. And I encourage you to go elsewhere in Greece because it's my favorite place.
so folks, let's give Jeff a big virtual round of applause for another one of his great presentations. We'll see Jeff at some point in February. I'll be in touch soon, Jeff. Jeff, what's the new presentation you're working on?
I just got back, like literally, like yesterday. Last night I got back from Merida in Mexico. I went to the Yucatan for a week and a half. Not the beaches. I had no interest in sitting on the beach and like drinking tequila by the beach. I can do that here. I went to see colonial architecture, Mayan ruins, and interesting history. And I'm in the middle of putting together a presentation on that, which I'll have ready soon. So that might be a good thing if we're in the dead of winter and people are looking for something warm. That might be a good plan.
Yeah, so I'm already looking forward to that one, Jeff. So we'll see Jeff back in a couple of months. Folks, look for an email for me later today with a link to this recording. And please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey when the Zoom ends.
I'll include some info from a couple of your questions. I'll pass on to Robert to pass on to you. And as always, if anyone has any questions or comments, Robert will share my email, and you're welcome to contact me directly if I can answer any of your questions. I'm always happy to.
Yeah, I'll definitely include Jeff's email address and follow Jeff on Instagram as well. I'll include that as well.
Always.
So okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Great job as always. So thank you everyone so much. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. See you next time.